15 years ago today, the first of 6 episodes of the BBC nature documentary, South Pacific, was released on BBC Two. It was narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch and focuses on the animals, plants, people and natural phenomena of mostly the South Pacific Ocean. It was made by the BBC's Natural History Unit in collaboration with the Discovery Channel. This particular episode gives an overview of the diversity in the South Pacific. As a side note, I will be mostly using the traditional names of animals and locations featured in the series. This first episode begins similar to many of the segments in the show, with aerial shots of islands, before showing some of the subjects of the documentary, starting with peaceful shots of animals before showing dangers such as waves, volcanoes, and predators, as well as showing humans and some of the strange animals of the Pacific. Next segment shows footage of the inside of a wave, before showing a seal, then a human surfer riding it. Then cuts to a view of the Pacific from space, a visual shown in almost every episode. In this segment, we're introduced to one of the weirdest themes in the series, a constant focus on the archipelago Hawaii. The islands appear in almost every episode, despite not at all being in the South Pacific, being approximately 2,370 kilometers north of the equator. Next, the episode shows us an iceberg heading northward from Antarctica before taking us to Macquarie Island, a tiny uninhabited island in the Australian sub-Antarctic regions, and the breeding location for southern elephant seals, Mirounga leonina, and royal penguins, Eudypteles schlegeli, which form huge colonies on the island for weeks to months every year. This, in fact, is the only time and location where these penguins ever travel onto land in their adult lives. The next segment follows the Antarctic circumpolar and Humboldt currents past Antarctica and up the coast of South America to the Galapagos Islands, where we see Galapagos sea lions, Pseudophilus wallabici, and Galapagos penguins, Spheniscus mendiculus, the world's northernmost penguins. These currents provide nutrients to the equatorial Galapagos, which allow these usually cold water animals to survive there. But in El Nino years, the narration tells us, the water's warm, changing the flow of the currents and removing the nutrients these animals depend on to survive. Next, we travel to Matoma Island in the Torres Islands of Vanuatu. The dominant organisms of Matoma are robber or coconut crabs, Birgus latro, the largest extant terrestrial invertebrates, which are actually a type of massive hermit crab. They are one of the very few animals able to crack open coconuts, Cocos nucifera, and are found in almost all locations where these palms are found, other than on the mainland. It is then revealed that they cannot survive in water, and that how they have become so widespread despite this is because the females lay their eggs in the ocean, which are then carried away to other islands where the larvae mature. The next segment covers how some animals, especially insects and other small terrestrial invertebrates, as well as the seeds and spores of plants and fungi, could be carried by cyclones to other islands. An example of this is Hawaii, one of the world's most isolated archipelagos, which is so isolated that in the 30 million years before it was settled by humans, under 500 species arrived there. It then talks about the Hawaiian fruit flies, Drosophila species, a lineage of fruit flies which have undergone insular diversification. In short, they've arrived on islands and become strange. Some of these include hammerhead flies, species on loan, whose males compete for mates by ramming their heads together, the claviceti fly, Drosophila, Drosophila claviceti, and Neoclaviceti, the males of which do a strange mating dance in which the males wave sex pheromones with their elongated abdomens and extend their jaws to display to females. There are more than 700 species of Hawaiian Drosophila, as well as nearly 300 species in the genus Scaptomyza, containing more derived members of the same lineage, all 1,000 plus of these species being descended from a few individuals that landed on Hawaii. The next segment continues in Hawaii and covers the main predator of these flies, the carnivorous caterpillars, larval form of the pug moths, genus Eupithecia, a widespread genus with only the Hawaiian species having carnivorous caterpillars, which camouflage as part of the environment, depending on the species what they camouflage with, and wait for a small insect to pass by before snatching and consuming it. Next, the series takes us to Pentecost Island, also known as Rag or Araga, in Vanuatu. The men of this island perform a yearly ritual known as gol, or land diving, in which they jump off a tower with nothing but vines around the ankle to stop it. This, the origin of bungee jumping, is a fertility ritual. The men aim for their hair to brush a small patch of ground, which is believed to make the crops grow taller.
The next segment it is introduced by the narrator briefly talking about the history of human settlement in the South Pacific, before showing the women of the Banks Islands using the ocean itself as a drum-like instrument, a traditional musical practice there. Next we go to Samoa Isisifu, to see the annual Palolo worm, Palolo viridis, spawning. Every year, 7 days after the first full moon in October, this year's will be the 24th of October, these worms, which actually belong to the same family as the infamous bobbit worm, disconnect their tail ends, which then release sperm and eggs into the water. The inhabitants of many Pacific islands will catch and eat the worms' tails, which they treat as a delicacy. The next segment occurs in the French frigate shoals, Kane Milohai in Hawaii. This small island is a nesting location for black-footed albatrosses, Phoebastria nigramps, and every year tiger sharks, Galiocerdo cuvier, navigate there in order to feed on the fledglings who are attempting their first flight, and due to only being on a very small island, they have to land on the water, where the sharks have the opportunity to eat them. Centers on one of the most interesting islands in the South Pacific, Anuta, an incredibly remote island that is a part of the Solomons. It is tiny, only 370,000 square meters, so small that the ocean could be heard from every location on the island, but it has a population of 300 people, one of the highest population densities in the entire world. But despite this, the Anutans are able to live sustainably off of or whatever small amounts of crops they grow. The men of Anuta have an interesting fishing technique unique to this island, in which they swim in the water and use octopus tentacles on a string to capture fish. The sustainability of Anuta is then juxtaposed with the tragic story of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, a tiny isolated island, which although now barren, once hosted a remarkable biodiversity, being covered in massive palms, Pachalococcus disperta, and the shores ringing with the calls from enormous seabird colonies. Multiple species and genera mostly undescribed. The Easter Islanders, also known as Rapa Nui, arrived at some point between 300 and 700 CE and used the island's plentiful resources to build massive stone statues, the Moai, or Easter Island heads, which represented ancestral spirits. This tradition soon became much more competitive, with each tribe trying to build bigger statues than their neighbors, and in the process the massive amounts of wood were used to transport them, and this, as well as their eating of the seabirds and their eggs, drove much of the native biota to extinction, leaving only barren and silent hills and cliffs, as well as driving the Rapa Nui to cannibalism in order to survive. The next segment briefly returns to Anuta and shows the Anutans luring noddy terns, Anaus stolidus, in nets. They, like in all things, sustainably catch the terns, making sure to only catch mature adults, not as to not bring down the population. The final segment of each episode is a section known as South Pacific Diaries, which are 10-minute long behind-the-scenes segments. This episode's one, Monster Waves, covers the crew traveling to Pompeii in the Caroline Islands with surfer Dylan Longbottom in order to film the footage inside a wave for the second segment of this episode, as well as the opening titles and end credits of each episode. It documents their struggles with only having smaller waves in the first few days of filming, as well as having to engineer a large slow-motion camera in a waterproof casing before eventually getting the required footage when the conditions became more ideal. Well, that was the first episode of South Pacific. In my opinion, the episode is a little chaotic, jumping between segments with not much of a theme, though this does get better with the linked Anuta and Rapa Nui segments toward the end. And those definitely being my favourite segments, although I like most of the ones in this episode. My other criticisms of this episode, criticisms of the show as a whole that I have, that will be addressed over the coming videos. And, speaking of then, tune in for the next episode review next week. But, if you enjoyed this one, leave a like, maybe subscribe, check out my Discord server, check out my podcast. I think that's all. Goodbye.